Joining us on the panel right now is our friend John Gizzi. He is White House correspondent for Newsmax and Daily Beast columnist and former special assistant to President George W. Bush. Ron Christie is with us as well. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, Steve.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to both of you. All right, so I just had Joe Scarborough on. And yesterday, Nicole Wallace, when I asked her, told me that she thought Joe Scarborough would make a great presidential candidate because he's been through the media and he knows the media wars and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Joe, while very non-committal, said he would like to run for public office once again. He doesn't know when. He'll judge the field. He'll see what he thinks the public needs, et cetera. But he did say, and he did warn the liberal media not to underestimate him if he gets in. Do you, Ron, think that Joe Scarborough would be a serious presidential contender?
Well, I think he'd be a serious contender in the sense that, Steve, he'd certainly have the ability to raise the money and to use the platform that he has on his show and Morning Joe and MSNBC to get a lot of people to pay attention to him. Now, the only thing that I would say that might hinder his campaign, and I like Joe Scarborough, I've known him for years, is I just don't know, and I don't see how he could get out of the early primary states such as New Hampshire and Iowa to position himself for a run in South Carolina and some of the other early primary and caucus states. So he's got a lot of crossover appeal. He's got a lot of ability to raise money. I just don't see it right now.
And of course, he'd have to leave the TV show once he officially announced. What about it, John?
My problem, or rather Joe Scarborough's problem, in my view, is not so much with the liberal media, but with the conservative media. Remember, Joe was a hardcore, good-as-gold-water conservative when he was in the House of Representatives, except for his votes on offshore drilling in his home state of Florida. In the MSNBC niche, he has drawn attention and gotten high marks from the press for his jabs at fellow conservatives. It's very much like Barry Goldwater. We were told he was a wise statesman after he started throwing zings at the right. I think that would be a problem in primaries. So picking up on what Ron said, if he came out of New Hampshire and Florida unscathed and then went into South Carolina and some of the more conservative states, I think he'd have some problems.
I want to talk about a report that Jay Carney may be leaving as press secretary for the White House. And in particular, I want to ask, John, I don't know if you were at any of these briefings where...
I just left Jay
Carney
to be with you.
Okay, well, Jay Carney, excuse me, he's come under some criticism because he's plugged a book that his wife, Claire Shipman of ABC News, has just written. And I don't know what briefing he actually did that at, but I know he did it at a recent briefing or one or two. So what do you know about the reports that he may be leaving, and how appropriate is it for him to be bringing up his wife's book at a press briefing?
All right, let me take the questions 1, 2. I think that probably the odds on him leaving the White House run the gamut from A to B. Jay Carney is not going to leave at this time, particularly when one has Obamacare coming up for a grade on March 31st, the crisis in Crimea, which he devoted much of his news briefing to just a little while ago, and, of course, the immigration bill, which was the second most talked about topic. To bring in a new man or woman at the podium for the daily briefings, as well as to brief the president before any interviews, is just a case of bad timing at this point. I say he stays.
Okay.
As for plugging his wife's book, let me tell you something. That might cause problems for other press secretaries. Jay and Claire, Jay Carney and Claire Shipman, belong to the Georgetown Dinner Party group. They have been fixtures in Washington for a long time. People are mostly amused by this at worst.
Okay, and what about it from your point of view, Ron?
I largely agree with that analysis, Steve. I think that, I look back to the George W. Bush administration and the transitions that we had with our White House press secretaries, and you really wanted to have a significant amount of overlap between the two. I think that with everything that's going on, as John has noted, with the crises overseas, with the certain uncertainty with what Obamacare's enrollment numbers are going to be at the end of this month. I don't see it in the cards now, but I would see it certainly by the end of this year. And I wouldn't rule out someone like Jennifer Palmieri, the White House current communications director, who has a very good rapport with the president and who is well and uniquely positioned with the West Wing as well as members of the press. So I don't think it would be as dire as some might think.
And what about the ethics involved with Jay Carney plugging his wife's book?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I for having sat in the White House briefing room on numerous occasions in my time in the White House, the press tend to have a good relationship with the press secretary, and if Jay is off the record and not for attribution, talking to them about his wife's book, I really don't see too much of a problem with it.
All right, now, John, I don't know what was what part of the immigration topic was broached at the press briefing today, but let me ask you about this, and if this was part of it. Barack Obama launching a review on how Homeland Security handles illegal aliens. In other words, he's looking for leniency. He's looking for what he calls humanity. He wants, basically, I believe, people not to be deported if they don't absolutely positively have to be deported. In other words, if there's a way around their deportation, he's asking Homeland Security to find it. And to me, again, that's just another dictate from this president. Was that discussed?
It was broached, but Jay Carney, typically as when controversial topics can arise, he weaved and bobbed and did not deal with it, I felt at least. It is true that the president is launching his own mini-campaign against deportation when possible, although I've been in the room when Jay Carney has reminded people about the number of illegal immigrants with criminal records being deported and how successful the administration has been. It so turns out that we're having this discussion, Steve, days after a headline on page 1 of the Washington Post said that the president's support among the Latino American population has diminished primarily because of the D word, deportation.
What about it, Ron?
Well, it goes back to one of my biggest problems with the president and this administration is that the president's job under the Constitution is to faithfully execute the laws that are passed by the Congress. And, once again, we have a scenario where the president's trying to pick and choose to enforce laws he likes and to ignore laws he doesn't like. If the statute provides that the president is supposed to deport people who are not here legally, I think he ought to do so. And, this weaving and bobbing I find a little bit untoward for the president.
I love the boxing analogy that you picked up on from John. Now let me tell you what Tom DeLay said. We only have 2 minutes, so I'll give you each like 45 seconds here. Of course, Kerry met with his counterpart, and, he came out, and they met for 6 hours or whatever, and, they're deeply concerned. They don't want the election to go forward. He did say Russia has legitimate claims or concerns about Ukraine and ties to Ukraine. They want a different kind of resolution. And Tom DeLay said, what Kerry didn't tell you probably is that his counterpart, the foreign minister of Russia, probably told him to go jump in the lake. What about it, John? What's the impression you got?
My impression could be me echoing the words of my colleague from Le Figaro and the current U.S. ambassador who was formerly a UN ambassador. They both said they've known Lavrov for 10, 20 years. He lied to them years ago. He's not doing it any differently with Kerry.
Yep. Okay. So nothing gained there. Is there any way out of this other than that election and the annexing, if you will, of Crimea, in your view, Ron?
I don't think so. I think Vladimir Putin has had a long-term strategic plan, and this is part of his plan to have the Crimea formally annexed by Russia, and I don't think any amount of U.S. diplomacy or NATO diplomacy between now and the vote in a couple of days will change that. I think the real politicking will take place after this vote.
Ron wrote a great piece at the Daily Beast on in defense of Paul Ryan, and in our next panel discussion, we will broach that. John Gizzi, Newsmax White House correspondent, and Ron Christie, Daily Beast columnist and former special assistant to George W. Bush. Thank you both, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us, Steve.
My pleasure. All right, folks, when we come back, the one and only Mary Madeline will join us, and she will weigh in on some comments made by Nancy Pelosi and so much more on the Steve Malzberg Show on Newsmax Television.
The Steve Malzberg Show.